The first rays of sunlight had just touched the black forest, so typical of Baden Württemberg. When Miriam Keller woke up, she sat in her small wooden house near Riedlingen, listening to the woodpeckers tapping on the old oak tree in her yard. It seemed like a peaceful morning. Just a few hours later, this very morning would be remembered for months as the most terrible day in this quiet region. At 8:12 a.m., train Ray 43 left Sigmaringen station with over 90 passengers, heading towards Ulm. In carriage to sat Jonas Meyer, a 34-year-old engineer who had just finished a survey for a wind power project. He opened his laptop, hoping to finish a report in time for an afternoon meeting. Across from him, an elderly woman in her 70s smiled warmly. "Off to work?" she asked. "Yes, I'm planning to get home early today," Jonas replied. He had no idea just how far away soon would turn out to be. Meanwhile, a few kilometers away, Miriam, a railway patrol officer, was walking along the tracks near the Rodich River. The heavy rains of the past few days had softened the ground. Water flowed down the hillside in streams, squeezing through rock crevices and spilling directly onto the tracks. She noticed a few small cracks in the ground near the rails, but they weren't big enough to warrant closing the line. "Maybe we just need to keep an eye on it," she thought, making a note in her logbook. What Miriam didn't know was that just a few meters away, beneath the damp soil, a stream had been silently hollowing out the hillside all night long. Around 8:37 a.m., the train was passing through the forest near Riedlingen. The sky was heavy with low-hanging clouds. Jonas looked up as he heard the patter of rain against the window. Some passengers were standing up to put away their luggage, while others were dozing. The train slowed slightly as it entered a curve. Jonas knew this section. Ray 43 passed through it regularly, and the speed limit on the bend was 90 kilometers per hour. Suddenly, he heard a strange noise, like metal being dragged underneath the train. Then, a jolt. The laptop on his table tipped over and crashed to the floor. It all happened in a split second. "What's going on?" cried the old woman opposite him. Before Jonas could answer, the entire train car shook violently and tilted sharply to the right. The windows shattered. Screams mixed with the sound of bending metal. The carriage derailed and crashed into the trees at the edge of the forest. Then, everything went black. Miriam was just packing up to head back to her vehicle, when the ground beneath her feet trembled slightly. A loud bang echoed from the tracks, followed by a long, thundering crash. Instinctively, she ran towards the sound. When she got there, she froze. Carriage 3 was nearly derailed, listing sideways, part of its body embedded in a snapped pine tree. Smoke hung in the air. The smell of oil and hot metal filled her nostrils. "Is anyone in there?" Miriam shouted. Inside, there was a deafening chaos of crying, calls for help, and someone hammering against a window. She rushed over immediately. The door to carriage 2 was jammed, but a gap was just wide enough for Miriam to see a man with a head injury trying to pull a woman from her seat. She pushed against the door with all her might, but it wouldn't budge. "Wait for me," she yelled, running to find the iron bar that the railway company always kept near inspection points. As she turned, she saw Jonas, who had just managed to escape through a broken window. "There's someone trapped inside," he said, his voice weary, but his eyes still bright. "Let's get it open." Miriam nodded. The two used the iron bar as a lever. After a few tries, the door swung open. Passengers were helped out, many with bruises, but alive. Jonas turned to Miriam. "Thank God you got here early." Miriam said nothing, just clenched her fists. She knew the reason she was there so early was because she, too, had underestimated that crack this morning. A chill ran down her spine. Could I have prevented this? 30 minutes later, the sirens of ambulances and fire trucks echoed through the forest. Emergency services cordoned off the area and began transporting the injured to hospitals. Rescue helicopters landed in a nearby clearing. By noon, the news had spread throughout Baden Württemberg. The press called it the worst train accident in 20 years. 3 people died at the scene, and more than 40 were injured. Jonas received first aid, but refused to get into the ambulance until he was sure every passenger from his carriage had been taken away. Miriam stayed at the scene, cooperating with the police, her eyes red with shock and anguish. A few hours later, the federal investigation team arrived. In charge was Chief Engineer Heinrich Vogel, known for his difficult demeanor. He ordered every rail to be turned over, every layer of soil under the train to be excavated. That afternoon, Vogel found Miriam. "You were the last person to inspect this section of track?" he asked. "Yes," Miriam replied, standing straight, though her hands were still trembling. "Did you notice anything unusual?" Miriam told him about the small cracks. Vogel was silent for a moment, then said, "It's not your fault. The rainfall over the last 3 days exceeded the average for the entire month. The hillside was hollowed out by the water," he explained. "With that much water, even a small underground current could have caused the ground beneath the tracks to collapse." Miriam lowered her head. "But if I had raised the alarm earlier, maybe the line would have been closed." "We don't know that. We have to investigate. It could have been the old track design, the drainage system, a natural disaster, or all three." This didn't comfort Miriam, but at least she knew the cause was likely beyond the scope of a single patrol officer. 3 days after the accident, Jonas appeared at a state government press conference, representing the group of survivors. Journalists fired questions relentlessly. "What did you feel before the train derailed? Did you think the train was going too fast?" Jonas answered each question one by one, but finally said what had been on his mind the whole time. "I don't care whose fault it is. What's important is that no one wants this to happen again. Whether it's outdated infrastructure or extreme natural disasters, we have to deal with it." His words silenced the room. The next day, newspapers published their analyses. Some asked, "Did climate change intensify the heavy rain? Has the railway network adapted?" Others pointed to a number. More than 20% of the state's railway lines were built half a century ago and hadn't been renovated. The people of Riedlingen talked about it everywhere. Some blamed nature, some criticized the railway, some were simply afraid. 5 days after the crash, Miriam had to return to the accident site with the investigation team. As she stepped onto the old tracks, she felt just as she had that morning, except now. The rain had washed out a crater more than 2 meters wide. "See," Vogel said, "this couldn't have been seen from the surface. The small streams were the most dangerous part." But Miriam felt something was wrong. It wasn't just the landslide. Her intuition, which had helped her spot dangers so many times before, told her this incident was no mere accident. She examined the bent rails more closely. Some were more worn than usual. She asked Vogel. He frowned. "We're looking into that. If the rails were worn down over a long period, it could be a long-term maintenance issue, not just the rain." Miriam's chest tightened. If rail maintenance was the problem, then the accident wasn't a natural disaster, but a systemic failure. A week later, Jonas returned to the crash site to find his lost laptop. Not for the data that was all saved in the cloud. He just wanted to quietly get a better sense of what had happened. Miriam ran into him. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "but every time I hear a train, my heart still aches." They stood in silence for a moment. Jonas looked at the crater. "Do you think it was a natural disaster or an infrastructure failure?" Miriam sighed. "If it was a natural disaster, we can still prevent it. But if it was an infrastructure failure, the worst part is the uncertainty of how many other tracks are about to collapse." Jonas nodded. "I think that's what worries everyone." 3 months after the accident, the Federal Commission for Engineering Investigations released its conclusions. The primary cause, an underground landslide resulting from rare, heavy rainfall. A secondary cause, the drainage system in that section of track was deteriorated and could no longer divert water properly. A contributing factor, the rails were laid on an unstable foundation, not reinforced to modern standards. In other words, it was part natural disaster, part infrastructure failure, and part outdated standards that were not modernized in time. The report ended with a thought-provoking sentence: "There was no single cause. The accident was the result of the interaction of many small factors that were overlooked by the system." Miriam was not found personally at fault. Still, she requested a transfer to the safety department where she could change the very processes she had once relied on. Jonas returned to his job and began writing a monthly blog post about transportation safety and infrastructure. He didn't exaggerate, he just spoke the truth. We only recognize the weakest links in our society when they break, and Riedlingen, the small town in the forest, was as peaceful as ever. The RE43 line was completely reinforced, but every time the train passed that curve, people would look up as if listening to see if the ground beneath them was trembling slightly. Because after that day, everyone understood one thing: a major disaster sometimes begins with cracks so small, no one even notices them. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into the events that shape our world.